Our Bible reading this week is going to come from Acts chapter 4. I'm going to give you just a little bit of insight into that text that we hope will help you along as you're doing your reading this week. A big idea. I think that we, to make that point, need to look back at chapter 3, because in some ways we're continuing the story from chapter 3. There's the miracle of healing in Peter's sermon.
Now comes the fallout.
Now comes the fallout. That's exactly right. So when you think about chapter 4, well, they're really, the big idea is the continued persecution. And if you wanted to structure that a little bit, verses 1 through 22, you basically have the authorities dealing with the apostles and what they've been teaching. And then beginning in verse 23, you have them going back to their brethren after they're released from jail. And we see how they react. I guess we could call this, two reactions?
Yeah.
To the miracle. So in that first section, essentially you have the Sanhedrin that sets upon them.
And the high priests, Annas and Caiaphas, are named. And I think that's part of the shocking thing about this particular part of the story. You got to remember, it's just a few months after this same group sentenced Jesus to death. And so isn't it fascinating that Peter, who fled on that night when Jesus was tried by these people, now there's this bold preaching in front of the same men who condemned Jesus to death just some weeks before.
Yeah, we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard.
That's right.
So, courageous defense by Peter. The other thing that I think is interesting in that first section is the acknowledgement of the authorities.
Yeah.
That they could not deny the miracle.
No.
And I think that, there is that sort of snobbery as people look back on the ancients and think somehow they were all backward and ignorant.
Listen, suckers for this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think I've heard you make the point before. Look, they knew when someone was dead and came back to life. And they knew when a guy had laid there lame all those years and suddenly could walk again. They knew a miracle. And what the authorities are in essence acknowledging is there's no rebuttal to that.
Which is the same thing that happened, especially in John's gospel with Jesus. But they get to that same point with Jesus. So again, the parallels, and we're meant, I think, to see the parallels, that the apostles are now having to walk the same Jesus walk. And the same Jesus experiences, and confront literally the exact same men in Jerusalem.
So the next segment is going to be 23 through 37. They leave this hearing before the council. They're set free, and they go back to their brethren. And really, even in this section, they're kind of two pieces, because 23 through 31 would be the discussion of what's happened and their response to it, that prayer. Maybe we could tap verse 28, because I think sometimes people have a question about what your hand and your purpose predestined to occur.
Right, that language of predestination scares us a little bit, doesn't it? Sounds like, that whole God, if God is, declared what's going to happen, is free, how is human free will real? And I don't think this passage in any way, supports that kind of an idea. I think the idea simply is God, God's knowledge of the future does not necessarily determine the future. It's just like someone so well, you can predict what they're going to do. God, on a much higher level, is able to know what we're going to do without causing it. He's God, and that's just a perk. And so and I think all Peter's really saying is it's playing out exactly like God's plan accounted for. And those who are rebelling, and those who are following God are following God. And the word of Jesus goes forth anyways.
One of the things that impresses me about their prayer is they don't ask God to take away their enemies. They don't ask God to remove the danger. They ask God to make them bold in their preaching. Help us keep on doing the right thing.
Fulfill our role.
Even though we're facing adversity. I just think that's really, really interesting. And you talk about some takeaways for us. That's something to ponder. And then there's that closing section that is actually going to be also a setup section.
Chapter 5. That's right.
We have this
chapter breaks in the wrong place again.
It sets up in a couple of ways. First of all, it reveals a little bit more about the early church and the closeness. They were one heart and one soul.
And the staggering generosity.
Yes. And it introduces Barnabas, which is kind of Luke's style.
Yep.
He'll put someone in there that he's going to develop and use later on.
Right.
And then the other thing it sets up is the generous giving, which will be the contrast for Ananias and Sapphira,
Right.
which is sort of it's the first big church blow up, first big problem the disciples
That's
face.
one way to describe what happened.
I tell people sometimes, give you a little preview for
Yeah,
next
that's
week.
right.
I tell people sometimes, says, whatever you face in the church, if nobody's died, isn't as bad as Acts 5.
That's exactly
They
right.
were taking out body bags in the early church. We'll look at that next week. For this week, spend some time reading Acts chapter 4.